You're listening to the Playlist Podcast, where we talk to engineers, designers, artists, musicians, athletes, and authors, all kinds of people from all walks of life, to find out a little bit about them and the video games that influence them along the way. I'm Benjamin Dorr. This is Playlist Episode 3, and today we're diving in with writer, photographer, historian, and cultural archaeologist Sean Reynolds. Sean covers ghost signs in Melbourne, so photographing old faded signs and researching them and uncovering their stories. He's been doing this on Instagram and has built quite a following for himself in Australia, especially the state of Victoria, and you may have heard him on ABC Radio. This is a really interesting journey into how Sean became a cultural archaeologist, but also, life transitioning from the US to Australia, some of the differences, and obviously some of the games along the way that kind of shaped his perspective and captured special moments throughout. So let's jump in.
We've known each other a long time, and I think, I kind of have some idea of your journey, but I think most people, especially in Australia and Melbourne, Victoria, would know you as the ghost signs guy. And I know,
You're not
kind
wrong.
of look at it, you look at it as you're a cultural archaeologist. So I think, I'd like to kind of hear your take on how you perceive yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I think I have fallen into this thing where I'm kind of this character in a way, the ghost sign guy. I've been recognized on the street for it and everything like that. It's pretty wild. But it's a lot more than that, because a lot of other people have noticed ghost signs and things like that. So I'm not the first, probably not even the best. A lot of other people have done that and written books and things. I think though what I've done is coming from America and not having that background in I never grew up with a milk bar. I never knew what, some of these brands that are kind of, just ingrained in Australian culture are. I didn't know what they were. For me, part of it is not just taking pictures of the signs and posting pictures of the signs and being the ghost sign guy. It's also, digging up like this kind of culture, almost pop culture of the past, right? Because I guess we kind of look at pop culture as something that kind of started in like the 1950s with the advent of television, maybe a little earlier with radio, but you and I, we grew up in the 80s, 90s and everything, so we're right in that sweet spot of what pop culture kind of was or is. But there was pop culture back in the day, so it is a bit like unearthing a bit of a culture that doesn't really exist anymore. So there's a bit of archaeology to that, I think.
Yeah. And this is specifically, why I wanted to talk to you about, the games that influence you, because that kind of cultural archaeology, extends pretty broad. And I also know that you, your interest base is very, very broad, and I think, it'd be interesting to kind of hear some of your takes on games that influence you.
Yeah.
But also kind of the cultural impact of those games that may not be as widely known today.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's actually really funny because I never really thought about how had like games influenced me or what do they say about me in a way until you asked me to be on the podcast. And when I was like, okay, here, let me just list out these games. And I really started to think about it. And, there is a lot of interesting overlap with, my life and the games that I played as a kid and as a teenager and as an adult. So I think this will be an interesting journey.
Cool. All right. Well, how about we kick it off with your first game that you'd like to talk about?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the number one game that I think that has influenced me, the one that I always think of is Chrono Trigger. No, it was a game for the Super Nintendo. That's how I played it, the platform I played it on. And the storytelling element, I loved. Like the way, the choices you make, the journey you go on with all these characters and everything, the music, everything. It was so cinematic at a time when, it was like, 16 graphics and things like that, but it still was a very immersive game. And the choices you made kind of determine your character and your team's destiny in a way. And I think it was storytelling. It was more than just I loved all these fighting games, and we'll get into that later, or adventure games. But this was one where the decisions you made, impacted things and had a cause and effect, thing going on. It was, I think that shows a lot. That's a lot of my personality, that whole storytelling, and it shows where games have gone. A lot of things are immersing the player in these worlds and these characters and things. And I think that was for me, that was one of the big steps that I took. Playing Chrono Trigger.
And can you remember at what age and where, do you have a defining moment of coming across the game?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I started to play the game because, my brother and I, and a lot of these, it reminds me of my childhood. So playing games, we had an Atari. My dad would play. My dad loved pinball games. I still loves pinball games. I love pinball games. But we, it was always me and my brother, we got a subscription. It was to a magazine called Nintendo Power. And every month that would come out, they'd talk about the latest releases, and it'd have tips on things. And I think that's where we first saw it, because there wasn't a lot of advertising. I grew up in Indiana. There wasn't a lot of advertising for games like Chrono Trigger and stuff like that. So I think we first discovered it, in the 90s, I guess, when it first came out through Nintendo Power. I think my brother is the one who went and got it. And when we started to play it, and just the depth of the world and everything, I've played through it probably, close to 10 times, and it's a pretty long game. So it's that's kind of where it started.
And you grew up in Evansville, Indiana.
I did.
In terms of, that's middle America, and I grew up in country Victoria in Australia. Yeah. And I think, when you kind of grow up in areas that sometimes feel a bit isolated from, where things are happening, bigger cities, but did you find a lot of, outside of magazines and things like that, was kind of culture slow to come to Evansville as a kid, or?
Yeah, I guess things cinema and television was pretty mainstream. Music, that kind of things that are instantaneous and more kind of, I guess, globally homogenized, or at least through the country homogenized. Games were a bit different. I don't know anyone else of my friends back then that played Chrono Trigger. People knew things like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter 2, kind of some of these big games that also had a big arcade presence. Chrono Trigger, I don't know anyone else who played it. My brother and I were the only ones that I knew who had played it until I think I moved here to Australia and kind of got into the games industry for a while, and people knew about it. But and then it was kind of funny because even looking it up online, I was it was one of the biggest selling games in Japan, and it was a big hit in America. But back in the day in Indiana, no one would have even heard about it. It was kind of one of these things where, my brother and I discovered it, and it was something that we knew about or whatever, at least for a time. So that was kind of a interesting thing. And it just, I think games were one of those things that, unless it was a giant, massive kind of global recognized hit, it was, kind of niche.
Yeah. Were you solely a Nintendo kid? That was your jam? You didn't kind of mess with Sega?
Yeah, we were a Nintendo family. So we had I grew up fairly poor, so I kind of got the Nintendo late, but a lot of my friends had Nintendo, so I had played Mario, Super Mario Brothers or Mario Brothers, and Duck Hunt and things like that. We did have an Atari kind of, back then. So, I played all these other games, Pac-Man and Centipede and Q*bert and things like that. And then, we were a Nintendo family pretty much until I moved out, and then got into the PlayStation. We went with the PlayStation path. So I guess there's something to be said about brand loyalty, I guess.
Completely. In terms of, you mentioned moving out, what was your journey after leaving Indiana? Where did you end up?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I was born in Illinois. My dad was a grad student at this tiny university called Southern Illinois University when I was born. When I was 18, I moved back to Illinois, and I went to school at the same place my dad went for grad school, and had a great time. And again, a lot of video game memories there, with that kind of bonding experience with people. And then, just kept moving westward. I moved outside of St. Louis. I worked in television. I moved up to Portland, Oregon, worked in television and did some advertising stuff for Nike and places like that up in the Pacific Northwest. And then took the leap and went to Los Angeles and worked in television there for Warner Brothers. About a decade ago, I moved here to Melbourne. And oddly enough, all those places, it was like you keep hopping around trying to find yourself, find your place. And my place was over in Australia, which is wild. And now I'm the Melbourne Ghost Sign guy, which is, how weird life is.
I want to focus on LA for a bit because, some of your adventures in LA, and I think, you used to run walking tours of downtown LA, around Skid Row, but obviously around the architecture and the history. Was that a bit of a precursor to, you kind of becoming this cultural archaeologist and leading you to the ghost signs?
Yeah, I think so. Growing up in the Midwest, there are a lot of old buildings and stuff, and everything is just so run down, and a lot of stuff is just completely torn down. There's not like a lot of heritage movement, or at least there wasn't at the time. So a lot of the old buildings were kind of gone, a lot of the charm and character. Where I grew up, when I picture, Evansville, Indiana, I see it as kind of a pretty bland, characterless place. There's a lot of like strip malls. You have to drive everywhere. There's no public transit really to speak of. Then when I finally, when I got to Portland, I really started to like look at some of the old buildings and stuff and kind of, wondered, what was this like? The whole Pearl District in Portland is a big, former warehouses and stuff that have been converted into lofts and buildings and stuff, businesses and stuff like that. But yeah, when I got to LA just, the architecture and the history really entranced me, to be honest. Like, I love cinema. You and I bonded over our love of movies and film. And, one of the reasons I love it so much is like, there is this kind of like history, from Hollywood, from Los Angeles. And yeah, so I worked with the LA Conservancy. I did a couple of walking tours of some of the old buildings and the old cinema houses and giant movie palaces. And that really kind of was the precursor to me looking at a city. And you look at Los Angeles, and it almost looks like it was birthed out of the ground in like 1920. And you have all this kind of like that architecture and the Art Deco stuff, and then some of the more 1950s space age looking stuff. But it actually used to be a beautiful, huge Victorian era city that mostly is gone. I think there's like one little neighborhood that has like all these beautiful Victorian homes and stuff. But for the most part, the freeways and everything ripped everything out. And then on Broadway in downtown Los Angeles, you have some of the old movie palaces. The LA Theater and the Orpheum are still there. The United Artists Theater, I know you and I have gone there and everything. So yeah, there's some of these really beautiful movie palaces are still around. And that was kind of the beginning of me looking at something and saying, hey, there's a whole culture here before all of this. What was that? And how did we lose that? So I guess that really was the beginning of my interest in the history through buildings and signage.
Yeah, I think downtown Los Angeles is similar to Melbourne in the fact that the layers are still there. I mean, you have a lot of ghost signs, you have a lot of kind of reclaimed spaces, but you can see what it was beforehand, and it has this flavor to it. So
yeah, absolutely.
I also want to pivot, you had a couple of career adventures in Los Angeles that I thought I'd bring up. And if you don't want to talk about them, that is good too.
No, I don't mind.
One of these was working on the Ellen show. I would love to kind of hear your take on your time working on that show.
Yeah. So I worked for Warner Brothers, over Warner Brothers marketing. So I basically did commercials for a lot of different various shows. So yeah, Ellen was one. TMZ was a big one I worked on. Extra. I worked on a lot of other like kind of smaller ones. But yeah, Ellen, for me, I didn't deal with Ellen one-on-one too much. I was on a couple of film shoots with her. We did a couple of promo shoots with her. And then I was basically the editor producer for these commercials and special projects. So by the time I got into it and I was working on stuff, I wasn't really dealing with her. I was dealing with her people. I had a really good working relationship with most people, but you could see Ellen was a figure who was kind of isolated. She was at the time, she was the biggest talk show host in America, which pretty much makes her the biggest talk show host in the world. Her success was, keeping all these other people together. And I think, when you're in Hollywood and you're in like the craziness of that kind of the creativity and the power and all this stuff, people will fight and do very devious things to hold on to that power, right? So I didn't have to deal with the toxicity too much, but you could see it. I mean, I think there's like, anytime someone has a lot of money and a lot of power, the people around them are going to fight tooth and nail to be, the right hand of the king type deal, or, person making the decisions and protecting, their, what they see as their investment to their livelihood as well. Yeah, the toxicity there, I didn't have, like, she never yelled at me. No one really ever yelled at me on that end. But you could see, yeah, she was very, very protected and kind of kept away from that kind of stuff. And I think, like, when all that backlash happened, it was kind of like, how could you not know this? And in some ways, it's like, yeah, you should know if you're fostering a toxic environment. But at the same time, she was so shielded from things. It's hard to say how much she was aware of it, whether she cared or not. I don't know. I can't speak to that. But yeah, working in LA was a crazy, crazy experience, but I did love it. I loved working there. I worked there for about 6 years and I had a great time.
My favorite
Too good of a time.
fact about you working in LA is when you were working with TMZ, you would appear on camera. And so if anyone's ever watched TMZ, kind of back in the day, they would have everyone sitting around talking about stories, drinking giant Slurpees, and you're on camera. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's like a nice kind of cameo, into pop culture, that somewhere out there exists numerous clips of you just hanging out in the background.
Yeah, it is funny. Like, typically I'm behind the camera because I was a writer producer for like the commercials, but I had to be on set, when they were talking. I stopped doing it because basically that you go into this room at like 6 a.m. It's like very early in the morning because we have to churn everything out. It's a news organization, more or less. I mean, we don't think of TMZ as news, I guess, but it is. It's like a news organization, and you record for about 2 hours, and they just record everything and then chop it up into like little segments and bits and everything. But what they'll do is, like, they have cameras all over the place, and when they need a reaction shot to something, they kind of scan through and say, oh, we need a big laugh. I've got a big laugh. I'm very loud. I'm like, I kind of throw my head back like a supervillain when I laugh. And what I found was anytime there was like a racist or sexist joke, they would cut away to me laughing, even though I wouldn't necessarily be laughing at that. I'd be laughing at something that happened, hours beforehand, but they needed that reaction shot. So I stopped doing it because I didn't want to be known as, the white guy laughing at all the racist jokes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had to kind of be careful with that. But, I'm also, I also did a lot of videos for back in the day for different organizations and stuff. And there's a lot of videos of me out there floating around if people are keen and want to find them. So, yeah.
Maybe we can turn it into an internet Where's Waldo game.
Kind of, yeah. Yes, yeah.
This seems like a good
old school, very beginning BuzzFeed fan, you can probably find some videos of me floating around. So, yeah.
This seems like a good opportunity to talk about your second game.
Yeah, well, another one of the games, I guess, would be, Maniac Mansion. Maniac Mansion was something that, again, my brother and I played a lot. And again, it's kind of that your decisions, whatever you do in the story dictates, what happens to your character. Like, even how you defeat the game. I heard there's like something like 7 or 12 different ways to beat the game, depending on which characters you choose. And I just found that so interesting. And that was back when, I played it on NES, but I knew friends and family who had it on like computer and stuff. So that was I think Maniac Mansion was probably one of the games post Atari that people really had talked about. And one of the reasons I loved it was, it's really an ode to these old 90s B movies. These tentacles and this weird mad scientist, and all this stuff. And it has a bit of Rocky Horror to it. It's got a bit of B movie, which Rocky Horror is also like an ode to B movies and stuff and going to the cinema. So I just loved it. I loved that you could take something. I think it was probably the first time I encountered a piece of media like that, where obviously someone had a love of one genre on one medium. So you obviously like B movies and stuff like that, and then transported their love of that into this story and immersive play of a video game. I mean, obviously we're still doing that to this day. That's, going back to that nostalgia well and everything. But I loved Maniac Mansion. I just thought it was brilliant, even as a kid. I was pretty young. It would have been like the late 80s, early 90s, I think, is when it came out. You know, it's probably 10, 11 years old, but that hit the sweet spot, you know. And then later on, I discovered, you know, the works of Ed Wood, and, you know, you start watching things, you know, Mystery Science Theater 3000, which also, you know, just makes fun of and kind of loves in its own way, like all these like B movies and everything. So yeah, it was kind of hit the sweet spot for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think those LucasArts games, you could really feel that the developers were creating a labor of love and putting those influences in even really early on. And then when you look back culturally, like I think of Elvira and I think, oh, yeah, there's Ed Wood. And it's like a kitsch, but a sincerity at the same time. And also, Maniac Mansion is a really fun game, but it's also not the easiest player experience when you revisit it. It's like pretty insane. But it was also at a period where, you know, they're not necessarily user testing all of this stuff or putting it in front of focus groups. They're like, we want to do this and we're all going to pitch in and we're going to like make like a crazy Frankenstein of an experience.
Yeah.
And you either like it or you don't, you know. I think that was to me, again, with all of those LucasArts games, something, you know, outside of the Indiana Jones stuff and things like that and the Star Wars stuff, very much a hallmark of like, you're either on this journey or you're not.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think what you're saying too about it not being user tested, it was a time when people were kind of just experimenting with the games. And I guess because LucasArts obviously had a lot of money. They were, you mentioned Star Wars, Indiana Jones. Obviously the film rights and the licensing rights had made Lucasfilm a lot of money. And then LucasArts was able to, play around and do some pretty wild things. So they had that like freedom to just make something totally crazy. And you're right. I think the other thing about Maniac Mansion is it's less about the end game of getting rid of the meteor or whatever, you know, that's controlling all these people. It's about the journey and like the discovery, like you're in this crazy house and like the different ways that you can, you know, different weird things you can do. You can steal the guy's hamster and you can put it in the microwave and all that. You can do such weird things. And that's one of the things I love about it, is how weird it is. It's a genuinely weird game. Yeah.
Going back to your career journey, so, you know, you leave LA, you move to Australia. What was your first impression of coming to Australia? I mean, being born in Australia, my lens I have is like, I don't have an exterior lens of, wow, I'm in Australia. Like, I'm just here, right?
Yeah.
I don't have that. But I can imagine moving from another country and you have all of this media influence of like Crocodile Dundee and I'm going to drop a deep cut here, but like Quigley Down Under, right? Stuff like that. I assume
Magnum PI, yeah.
You would have had, so I want to know like what your impression was when you arrived and what your expectations were, you know, as someone who it's the other side of the world and you've grown up with all this media.
Yeah, you know, in America, a lot of what we kind of know about Australia, the handful of things that we know about Australia is basically, you know, you see the Sydney Harbour Bridge, or you see, you know, the Opera House. Like those are icons, I guess, of Australia. Like obviously the animals, the kangaroos and the koalas and things like that. But yeah, you mentioned Crocodile Dundee, and I think, you know, every time they show him in Australia, he's kind of in the outback or in like these very small towns, or he's in like a dusty old pub where everything looks like it's, you know, time has stood still or whatever. In the 80s, I remember so many of the like kind of family sitcoms and stuff. They would have an episode where they went to like Australia on vacation and something happened, and there was always a boomerang involved or something. I will bring up that Simpsons episode where they go to Australia and they just, you know, they mercilessly mock Australia just the way they mercilessly mock, you know, America. So it's, you know, it's pretty fair, but and there's a lot of truth to it in some ways. That Simpsons episode, I think it's an endearing thing. But then, yeah, I really didn't know what to expect, because I'd never traveled to this part of the world. When I first got here, I was actually amazed at how big Melbourne was, how spread out it was. But I was also amazed, you know, the public transit here. We've all had pretty terrible public transit stories and everything. But on the whole, you know, I didn't have a car for the first 7 years that I was here, and I got around everywhere. And I thought that was like amazing. I was able to jump on a train and go explore, you know, a suburb and check things out and try new restaurants and everything. So, you know, Melbourne's such a multicultural city. It's one of the things I love about it is it is it is truly a melting pot where everyone comes from somewhere else, whether it's, from country Victoria, and even, then like, your ancestors would have come from Britain or the British Isles or Europe or whatever. So, and then, all these people from all over the world, and some of the best food in the world is here because, some of the best chefs from other countries have moved here and opened restaurants. And anyway, like, so my first impression was just like how big it was. And I guess my second impression was just how everything's very similar to America, but slightly different. So, I get like a lot of we'll talk about food brands because I guess, that feeds into Ghost Signs. A lot of the food brands are different. Like we don't, the condiments are slightly different. Ketchup in America is actually slightly different than tomato sauce here in Australia. So they're cousins, but they're different. So yeah, just some of those little differences. And I will say the other thing is Americans love an Australian accent, so it's nice to just be surrounded by that, even if sometimes I can't understand what people are saying.
Although, as an Australian who's toured extensively in the US, I do get the "Are you from London?" question quite a lot. I do think, there's the nuance of, separating what the accent is. Going back to food brands, like I grew up reading a lot of comic books, like Marvel, DC. I mean, in comics, you would get American cereal ads. And so in Australia, like breakfast cereals are not that exciting. You've got like Nutri-Grain, Weet-Bix, they're fine. But on my first trip to LA, which was in my mid-20s, like I went to a Pavilion supermarket and I went to the cereal aisle. And this aisle was just like so big and vast, and there was so many different types. And I walked away from that supermarket with about 6 boxes of cereal and a 6-pack of Tab. Like Tab was really big here in the 80s, and then they stopped making it, but they still made it when I went to, the US. So my friends thought I was insane because I was just knocking back Tab and, eating Lucky Charms like it was no tomorrow. It's a different experience. We're generally very practical in the way we put food together. Like, there's no glitz and glam, but I think America's always been really good at high fructose, amazing items.
Yeah. America's a place where even the cereal aisle has a bunch of razzle dazzle, right? So yeah,
100%.
Yes, in some ways.
Yeah. Let's go to game number 3.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I guess I talked a little bit about earlier, like what I kind of realized when I was putting this list together was that like almost every kind of like every point in my life, every different point in my life, there's a video game to go along with it. So the third one I put down was Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 came out when I was a teenager. At first, it's kind of a novelty because it's like so graphically violent. Like every time you hit someone, just a bucket of blood comes out of them and stuff, and you end up being able to decapitate them and stuff. For me, it was, on Super Nintendo, I had Mortal Kombat, and I was in marching band. I played the saxophone. I was lead saxophonist, and we would do things on Friday nights. Typically, we would be in the pep band. We would play for football games or the basketball games, whatever was kind of going on in my high school. And then afterward, a bunch of my bandmates, we'd all go over to my place. I lived out in the country, so we had a lot of space. We could be loud. Yeah, and we'd play Mortal Kombat rounds and eat Doritos and drink Mountain Dew and all these very American sounding things. Yeah, Mortal Kombat has a real special place in my heart. In my ripped out of my chest, still beating heart. Yeah.
I think I remember Mortal Kombat as being this like so punk rock and so like this is what video games are about, because it was super edgy. But I didn't really enjoy playing it that much. Like I kind of like, and even to this day, like I appreciate the gore as a fan of horror and gory stuff. But I never I didn't get into it on a deep level, even though I can understand it. But as a franchise, like that game now it's so visceral and so like the kills are just so crunchy and so, it's an amazing franchise because it's stuck to its roots and just refined, in the same way that like Final Destination is a film franchise is.
Exactly.
It started modestly and now it's this, well-oiled machine. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the kills keep getting gorier and crazier. And they've even folded in, like Jason Voorhees is in it, Freddy Krueger's been in Mortal Kombat. So yeah, they started to fold in a lot of these kind of horror icons as well. So yeah, I guess that there's that horror root to things, and I think that that base, it starts from kind of this visceral horror and the kung fu movies and things like that, and it kind of folds all this stuff. Again, it's a lot like Maniac Mansion or Chrono Trigger in that obviously someone had a love of one or two things and was like, how do we mesh this together? So, a fighting game mixed with like over the top, like to the point of silliness, like kills, kung fu movies, kind of that import of the kind of movies that Quentin Tarantino would love, that kind of thing, and just kind of folded them all in. And yeah, it's just been, they keep refining it in the story. It also had like a story to it. There was a story about like, you weren't just like beating people up and decapitating them. You were like, trying to, you had to go on this tournament to defeat the bad guy and save the world. So there's a lot of lore to it.
And those early Mortal Kombat films with Christopher Lambert, I mean, they're classics, right?
They are.
I think a lot of people would probably not know, given your current interests and work with the Ghost Signs, then wouldn't necessarily know that you also worked in video games when you came to Australia. How did you break into games, and give us a little bit? I mean, this is where we met as well. So give us a little bit about your experience from that.
Yeah, well, because I had worked in Los Angeles, I'd worked in Hollywood for like 6 years, and it's pretty grueling. So it's pretty much 10-hour days, 5 days a week. You get like 10 days off for vacation, and our team, we were very small. So we, it was hard to even get that 2 weeks off all at once. So I was pretty burned out, like having worked through all that. I had a great time, but after 6 years, I was pretty burned out. So when I moved over here, I didn't have much of a plan. I had a savings, and I just figured I'll find my way of something. And I thought, even if I'm working as a barista or, at a cafe or something, I just needed something different. Weirdly enough, though, after like about a month, I got pretty bored. And after a month, I got pretty bored, and I was like, I really should start looking for something to do, even if it's for part-time or whatever. And I just answered an ad on Seek, and I don't even think it said what the company was. It just was like, do you like pop culture? And, I was like, yeah, I love pop culture. Great. What is this? And it turned out to be a 3-month kind of temporary gig as a marketing coordinator Fire Monkeys Studios here in Melbourne. And that 3 months turned into 7 years. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Like what I found though was that because we were working on primarily you and I, we were working on racing games, and every 7 weeks we'd have a new update. So there's a new car, a new storyline, that kind of thing. And again, it's about that kind of immersion. So there was a lot of stuff that with video games that I saw parallels with television, because you had a pretty quick deadline. I'm trying to get it out there, trying to appeal to a mass audience, and trying to fold in different aspects of pop culture, which I think we did astoundingly well. And I had a great time actually working in video games. I mean, I'm not sure how deep you want to get into it. I've traveled the world with you, Ben. We've been to America. We've been to Hong Kong.
We have. I think back at that stage as well, like we were doing so much video content, live content. We were TikTok before TikTok was TikTok.
Yeah.
And it was great, but it was grueling, and we did it. That'd be a different podcast, but I think it was definitely a journey and an adventure of creativity as well. Like I think we had a lot of flexibility to engage, and we worked on some incredibly popular games that are still running to this day.
Yeah,
and plus years in, so it was definitely fun. Having worked in games for as long as you did, because how long were you at Fire Monkeys? Like,
I was there for 7 years. Yeah,
7 years. Yeah. Did you have a period afterwards where you couldn't look at a video game for a while? Like, did you get the burnout kind of?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it. I'm not sure how deep we want to go into it, but basically, our games still are alive and well, the ones we worked on. Very proud of the work we did, but financial decisions, they shut down the Australian wing of those games. So those games aren't the two games that we primarily worked on. The racing games aren't made and produced in Australia anymore. Yeah, after I kind of walked away from that, I was like, what do I do now? I kind of went back to where I was 7 years before, where I didn't know, I was working. I thought, it was kind of the same thing. You and I had worked so long. I know you left a little bit before I did, but we had worked on all these huge projects and made so much video content and made so many contacts and partnerships along the way. Looking back on it, it's astounding that we did so much with so little. But so when it was over, yeah, it's kind of back to square one, where I was like, oh man, I'm burned out. I don't want to do video games anymore. I don't want to work in video games. I actually still love video games. I still play video games, but I've completely pivoted to, I'm doing a lot of copywriting and a lot of stuff with, ghost signs and Melbourne and Victoria history. So I've really kind of reinvented myself yet again. But I mean, I think that's kind of the nature of creatives. You kind of find you don't necessarily have to stick with one thing. I left Fire Monkeys as a marketing person, and now I'm an author. I wrote a book about ghost signs, and I do speaking engagements. So it's all different, but in a lot of ways it's not, because it's still about storytelling. It's still about bringing stories to people. So yeah, it's different but the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think my take on your learnings maybe from that space is doing something with very little. And storytelling and building and media,
Definitely.
and yeah, like I've worked in games a long time. I've either worked in games or I've worked in film theatrical. And you do hit a point where you're like, hey, want to come home and I don't want to watch films and I don't want to play games. And I want to read a book about, the history of Tokyo. And I because it's hard. But I think, you go on the long journeys and then you reset, but you still, all of the learnings and you're always lifting weights. You're always, building those muscles. And I think that's the thing that I can see with what you're doing now that you've inherited is like, you spent a long time in an industry, you got buff creatively, mentally, and then you're using those skills, across, because it's also, everything is about attention. Like if you kind of lift it up, and everything is about, everything wants our attention now. And from looking at video games or looking at films or TV or influencers or stories, like you want to compel people and you want to be authentic and all of that stuff. So everyone at the base level is kind of doing the same thing. Be like, hey, look at my thing and look at my that.
Yeah.
But at least you were doing it with such insight and bring so much value to people and highlighting things that are in front of them, It's all that stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely learned so much. And look, I don't want to turn this into let me stroke Ben Dawes' ego thing, but I mean, looking back on it, one of the things I look at is that a lot of the partnerships we had were things that started almost with an idea of something that was interesting to you. And again, how do you all the games we've talked about so far on this podcast is someone loved a couple of different things and they smashed them all together and they made something. And that's what we did. You and I did a lot of that stuff. And that's kind of where it comes from. And I guess, you can apply that to anything. I do if people who aren't familiar, what I do is I take photos of old advertisements around Melbourne and Victoria. I take pictures of these old signs that are for businesses and stuff that don't exist anymore. Or have moved on. But I don't just take a picture of those. Then I look at the history of them and I try to tell a story about them in both a visual and in a written way that, is compelling. History is not static and it is interesting and there's so much going on. But a lot of that, it's just how do you frame this narrative in a way that is going to grab people, where it's not just, oh yeah, here's another racing game. That's all racing games are the same. That could not be further from the truth. And then when you start folding in all the different weird partnerships and stuff we brought to it, you can make it's about that alchemy of remixing things. I think that's one of the big things
and
I took away.
I think it's I always think of that Conan O'Brien episode of The Simpsons with the monorail. And Conan, plays this character where he's trying to get a monorail built in Springfield. So he sings this song, gets everyone chanting monorail, monorail. Because if you if you have an idea, it's not necessarily the idea itself that is the thing that will compel people. It's always the execution. It's always the story you tell. And, when you do something that's really hard and ambitious and that's out of the box as well, like you have to go monorail, monorail, monorail.
Yeah.
And I think that's execution is everything. Like
It is.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
passion that you bring to it and your insights.
Yeah. The execution, and I think, the passion, really, really being able to articulate why this makes sense, why it's, why it's interesting, why you should care about it. All those things. But it's about how, I think having that passion, that's at the core, that's kind of what it is. If you're not
Yeah.
passionate about it, if it's something you don't care about, if you can't convince yourself it's a good idea or it's a good thing, how are you going to convince anyone else? I think it's one of the things.
Wise advice.
Yes, exactly.
Let's
Get
move
some
on to
passion
the next title.
Yeah, and then I guess the next video game I really loved and I remember playing quite a lot. Again, another Super Nintendo game was Castlevania 3. And for that, it's just it's that kind of that classic Metroidvania. Obviously, comes from Castlevania, the side-scrolling adventure game. Just you're just fighting monsters and stuff. And again, I grew up. We only had like 3 television channels, and I think every Sunday there would be another Abbott Costello meets Frankenstein or Dracula. So I had like a lot of, my dad was really into like the old school Universal horror monsters and stuff, and I know you're a big fan of that thing too. So yeah, Castlevania 3 especially hit that sweet spot. And again, another game where there's different paths you take, and depending on which way you go, it changes the narrative and everything. So I found that really interesting, where you're not forced to kind of go one way. You can kind of choose your own adventure in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I think the tone of those games as well is like 100% goth. Like,
Yeah.
It's not just light in, they're like all in. And that's something that I think I appreciate looking back. I'm like, no, they were committed. And they're great action games as well.
Yeah.
But going back to Abbott and Costello, like I didn't really, like I probably discovered them as an adult through Universal Monsters. And, Abbott and Costello made, probably the most famous one is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which has got Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman. But they made a bunch of these like kind of horror comedies with the Invisible Man and the Wolfman. And what was great about them is that they kind of played the horror bits very straight, and so I've had a really good time introducing Abbott and Costello to my kids, and my son loves Abbott and Costello.
Yeah,
but
right.
specifically loves the monster ones, because there is a great tonal thing, and that also goes back to Maniac Mansion of like balancing, like, keeping the horror elements really authentic and not making fun of them, but then layering comedy on top. And it's a great combination. And I'd probably watch Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein once a year, definitely an Halloween.
Right. No, I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's ingrained in my memory. Like, yeah.
It's very good. It is very good. Given that you are kind of a man about town and you are capturing, photos and elements, what are some of a couple of your favorite spots in Melbourne from like a coffee or food perspective that you like to hang out in and that you feel best represents the Melbourne experience?
Oh my gosh. That's such a hard question. I literally was just having this conversation this morning with my girlfriend, just about how every suburb you go into, it has its own flavor. They always have a really great coffee shop. We're so lucky in Melbourne to have such great coffee everywhere, mostly everywhere. And it really depends. I mean, you can go into the CBD and there's just almost any kind of food you would ever want. There's a great restaurant for it. I think there's that. There's more great cafes or great bars, different kinds of bars and pubs and stuff around. So you can kind of get a lot of different flavor there. You could go to almost any of the suburbs and it's got its own unique twist on that. Fitzroy is different than Richmond and, very different, but there's still such a quintessential Melburnian experience. So, each of them have iconic pubs, they've got iconic music venues, they've got it'd be really difficult to say. And I think
Okay.
that's like, again though, it's like we're spoiled for choice. Where's the best place in Melbourne to go? It's like, oh well, God, I mean, what are you into? There's like there's a place for you, whatever you're into. There's weird niche stuff, and there's big broad stuff, and so yeah, gosh, that's a hard question. But I mean, I live in North Melbourne. I love North Melbourne. It's quiet and quaint, and there's a lot of history here, a lot of great cafes and food places. But it's also, it's an easy tram or even walking distance to the CBD, and yeah. So every place has its own kind of thing going on, and that's one of the things I love about Melbourne and Victoria. Even the towns outside of Victoria, they each have their own little vibe to them. A lot of the bigger ones have a lot going on, and some of the smaller ones have, they have little events and things. There's always something to do. So, yeah, I love being a Victorian. I love being a Melburnian. What can I say?
I think at the pace that you're going to be the official ambassador for the state of Victoria. But I agree. Like, again, having grown up here, I think that, there are little kind of hubs everywhere that bring their own take on things and their own identity. But even the, country towns now, I think a lot of young people have moved back and have started art galleries and cafes and
Absolutely
bringing culture. And I love that, for example, the town of Castlemaine will have great, gigs. And I think from, memory, like Cat Power and maybe like Iron and Wine played there. And this is like a good hour outside of the city. And it's like a town of maybe, I'm just pulling a number off the top of my head, but maybe like 50,000 at best.
Yeah.
But people come from surrounding towns, and Dalesford is another great spot. And yeah, food, coffee, music, art. It is definitely, a rich place to kind of visit and explore. But then you have the history underneath it. And obviously that's something you've been advocating and telling stories about. So
yeah, absolutely. You bring up that. I literally just got back from a road trip with my girlfriend who's in a band, and we did a road trip from here to Adelaide, and along the way we stopped at a couple of small towns, some to check out. One, they played a gig in Koroit. However, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Again, like, it was like such a vibe. It's kind of this, at first it was kind of like, looked like this kind of sleepy town where everything was kind of closed and stuff. But like both the big pubs were happening. We were there until like 1 a.m. and everything, just, having a few drinks and watching other bands play and stuff. And it was just, it was a lot of fun. And then the next day we kind of walked around the town, and, we walked into a bookstore, and there was a group of older gentlemen. They had their book club meeting going on. And I thought that was just, it's cute and everything and kind of quaint, but at the same time, it just shows like that community is still really strong. So there's still a lot of stuff going on. And the place we stayed, the woman was an artist. So yeah, a lot of artists have moved out. I'm a huge fan of the town of Chilton, which is a place that, about 8 o'clock at night, everything shuts down. And you think, oh, this town. But yeah, there's artists that live there, and there's this history, and there's a vibrancy to things, and these little boutique shops that have opened up. And yeah, there's a lot going on, beneath the surface of these places that, I think it's easy for people to dismiss them as, it's just this old, country town. But yeah, there's a lot of life going on. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Being in America, you'll literally see ghost towns. You'll see towns where like no one lives there anymore. Even a town that used to be big. I think Detroit, you think of Detroit. I mean, it's having a resurgence now, but only because prices got so, high and then low, and then the kind of economy bottomed out. There's no crime anymore because no one lives there, and now people are moving back into the city and revitalizing it. We haven't, you don't see that a whole lot here, at least in Victoria. Most of these places, they kind of were founded in the 1850s, and they're still going.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the gold rush in the kind of late 80s definitely was a town boom, and then there was the gold rush ended and the towns kind of found other industries. But I do think there is a potential for those towns. Like, it is slowly, people are finding ways, because, now you can live everywhere as a digital nomad, or you can start a local business and you can tell stories in that community. People are finding ways. So it's not down and out yet, but it's definitely, I mean, probably historically different to America in terms of industry. And obviously a lot of, American ghost towns where like, the mining stopped and everything collapsed, or all the
industry
come through the Rust Belt and stuff. Yeah, we probably have time for a couple more games.
Okay.
So maybe we'll move on to the second last one.
Yeah. Let's. I will go through. I want to mention. I do want to mention GoldenEye as one. So GoldenEye is like, when I was in university, my roommates and I would, every Friday, we would basically have people over. We'd all take turns playing GoldenEye, and sniping each other and stuff, and just drinking and having, listening to music and stuff. So it was a great way to make friends and everything like that. And it was just, I sucked. I was terrible at GoldenEye. I was never any good. I always got sniped, but it was just such a good time, and getting, just, talking smack with each other and everything. So, video games, that I think that's kind of a nice segue into what video games are kind of like now, where it's more, I mean, you can play them as a single player, but there's a lot of co-op games. There's a lot of online multiplayer games and stuff, which is where things have moved to. So video games have, as a kid, it was like me and my brother, or sometimes me and my dad. My dad liked to play Atari games. And that was great. But we get mad at each other and, have fights and stuff. Oh, you killed me, or oh, it's going to do this or whatever. But now, like, it's such a community thing. Mobile games, you can race against each other. There's all these like different Animal Crossing where you can visit other people's like lands and stuff, through the magic of the internet. I think it's become a way to meet people rather than be isolated. I think that's a really interesting and incredible thing that I never would have, that wasn't a possibility back then. But that GoldenEye was kind of, for me, kind of the start of it, because like you could play like 4 players and you could, sneak around and snipe each other.
Yeah. Have you played it recently? I think it's actually on Game Pass. Like there is a remastered of the original, but it's the original.
Yeah.
With, scaled up graphics. Have you played it, recently?
I haven't been playing it recently, but I did see that they had remastered it. And I think a lot of the games that I've talked about have had remasters and reissues and stuff. I didn't set out to be like all the games that I like were super popular globally, but these were just things that a lot of them were things that I just learned through, through like Nintendo Power or through, I guess, like osmosis. But there wouldn't be a lot of people to talk about with a lot of the games. A lot of the games that I've talked about have had remasters and reissues and sequels and things like that.
Yeah. You mentioned before your book, which came out very recently. Do you want to kind of give us a bit of a backstory on how the book came about and the title, and give people some insight into it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I never set out to be an author, and I think I'm still like, whoa, that's crazy. But during lockdown is when I started just to look at all these ghost signs and started writing these stories. And I was actually approached by Scribe Publishing, who thought that I had enough stuff there to turn into a book. And I thought, this will be easy. I've already taken all the photos. I've already written a bunch of stuff, but I hated everything I'd photographed. I hated everything I'd written, because it was kind of, it was my journey is what I started with doing it, and I put it on Instagram. And now I've got like 29,000 followers, and I put stuff out every week, and I'm still finding ghost signs. So yeah, I was able to write this book called Melbourne Ghost Signs, and it's these kind of like little vignettes about different, kind of starts with the sign, but the sign is just a starting off point for the story behind it. And when you look at it collectively, it's the story of us, our community, of Melbourne and its community. It's a story of like families and struggles and all these different eras throughout Melbourne's history. And then it's kind of also the story of like how that manufacturing had this big boom and everything, and now like we really don't produce that much here. We're more of a service industry. It's very interesting. There's a lot of layers to it, which is, yes, a pun about ghost signs and things and paint and all that stuff. But it's helped me look at Melbourne and Victoria in a kind of a different light because of that. And I understand things a lot better just because of that history. And I think, I try to make it as interesting as possible for people. So yeah. And here we are. I'm the ghost sign guy.
Ghost sign guy. Okay. Your final game that you would like to discuss.
My final game. I gotta talk about Mario Kart. I played Mario Kart in university, but now it's about this past Christmas, my daughter, my daughter got a Switch for Christmas, and Mario Kart first game like we all played. So we did some road trips across Victoria on Gippsland this summer, and she took it with us. And like me and my girlfriend and some of our friends, we all played with 6-year-olds. Just watching how she interacted in a way is figuring out, the strategy behind the smash pod and everything. It's a wonderful thing, It's like kind of see now, with my dad, like Atari games and things like that, and seeing the concept start to share hand-eye coordination, improving, and then like really embracing, this thing, and the graphics for and everything. And he always plays on the fastest setting. And he's always playing anything that's not the fastest setting. It seems so slow. It's like, oh, it's so slow. Oh my god. So, it's awesome to see that kind of, the next generation of players. Watch my daughter play games like I did. Play games. My girlfriend Michelle play games against each other and that talk. It's awesome. It's just great to see that. The next generation do it.
Yeah, there's such a joy watching your kids play games and figuring it out, or, smack talking with their friends. And I think, Mario Kart's such a common currency. Like a kid, we have a Switch and a kid will come over and say, I want to play Mario Kart. So my kids play Mario Kart. But then the kid leaves. My kids don't continue playing Mario Kart. But it's that common thing, like they'll jump in for that social kind of play. And I think that's the power of that franchise, is that it's such a known quantity that it will, does connect people. And it's also easy enough to grasp the basics of that. You don't there's no wall, to jump in. But yeah, I mean, I think parents playing games with kids, I don't have any memory of my parents playing video games with me at all. But I think as our generation has grown up, we've become a lot more open to doing that as a shared experience. And going back to what you were saying about community and games as community, as a place that we learn and we grow and we figure things out, and a safe space to fail, and get better. And all of these different elements, I think, that's the beauty of games. That's the thing that you look at and you're like, games are kind of life now. Like it's just a part of the social fabric, and a part of the journey of growth for young people, That's not to say there's not shitty bits about games. Like obviously there is, but in its purest form, like it is this great handing down of culture, handing down of knowledge, and also empowering children in a safe space to figure it out.
Yeah, very well said. I completely agree with you, though. Yes, it is. It's a nice way to dip their toes into game playing in a wholesome way before they have to start wading through some of the trash that's out there and the toxic people. But because it's such a wide, like everyone plays games. For older people who grew up playing pinball and Atari games are still playing. They're playing the next gen of games. And then, little kids. So it doesn't really matter. And you can kind of find your people in a way through gaming. So yeah, it's a really unique thing. And I guess that's probably, we're living through the golden age of that, where technology has caught up with creativity in a way where anything can kind of happen. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Sean, it's been a pleasure as always. And where can people buy your book or find out more?
Sure. People can, I do still post all the time, so people can jump on Instagram if they're keen for that. Melbourne _Ghost Signs is the handle that I'm on. And I post 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, just depending. I'm still finding ghost signs. But my book, you can find it almost anywhere. Reading some of the bigger local chains, but even check out your local bookstore, because it's probably in there. It's all over the place. It's one thing I'm very grateful for is how accessible it is. So check it out.
And that, again, is Melbourne Ghost Signs by Sean Reynolds from Scribe Publishing. And what else is coming out? You've got some plugs you want to chuck in at the end?
I do. I've got a few things coming up. I've got, I'm doing a lot of speaking tours. I'm doing a couple walking tours. And I'm also in the midst of making a podcast. So Ben, I am going to make sure that you do get on the podcast. So
love to.
We will talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to Playlist, and this is a podcast produced by the 3000s with intro music by Sam Shepard and also produced by myself, Benjamin Dorr. If you would like updates on the show, you can follow us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with links in the show notes below. And if you would like more content, please remember to give us a follow or a subscribe on your chosen platform. We'll see you next time.